So Swinburne's argument, Swinburne, a Christian theologist, a believer, also a philosopher, and he is going to give us many reasons why God might allow evil, and why that would still be logically possible to have a good God who allows evil sometimes. So let's go through his view. Now, just like I did with Nagel, let me give you this author's purpose. And first of all, he starts his article by making this point. He says, and this is a direct challenge to people like Nagel, by the way. Remember, Nagel said that it's really insensitive to say that evil is an illusion or something, to downplay evil. It's very insensitive. And Swinburne says that, look, some of what I'm going to say might sound insensitive to immediate suffering. But he says, look, I'm not here to provide you emotional comfort. And he points out that people who are in that situation, they don't need an argument. They don't need a philosopher to tell them anything. They need comfort from their loved ones. He says, I'm just trying to provide a logical justification for evil. So just personally, I kind of like Swinburne's tact here because it often goes in reverse. You often see the theologist as being more emotionally driven than the non-believer. But in this case, Swinburne is actually saying, no, look, if you're a non-believer, you need to be rational. Because if you're going to get too sensitive to suffering, to your personal suffering, or those in your life, you're not going to see the logic of my argument. So he tells us that we need to step back from our immediate place in the world. Now, some have criticized Swinburne's article here because he merely assumes that there is a good God like that there is a good God, and he then gives reasons why such a God would allow evil. So somebody more on Nagel's side in this argument might say, well, Swinburne, why are you assuming this to begin with? But to be fair, Swinburne has written other articles. This is just one that has this purpose to say, look, if there was a good God and he did exist, then this is what we would expect to find. This is why he would allow evil. So to put it as it is in that PowerPoint, his argument begins with the question, which is really his conclusion, that God allows evil for reasons. And he then proceeds to give the reasons. So I'll talk about each of his reasons in turn in this presentation. So first of all, you're probably aware from the reading in the lecture of the free will defense, which is often the first thing that comes up from believers when the problem of evil is presented. It's like, well, no, of course there's evil because there's humans are idiots and they've sinned, right? They took the apple in the Garden of Eden, and it's all been hell ever since, right? We're sinners. That's the idea. That's why there's evil. But of course, as you should also know, this does not account for natural evils, because there are natural evils like hurricanes and tornadoes that have gone on for as long as we know, as long as the earth has been around, that kill people unnecessarily, right? That seem to produce evils that are clearly not produced directly by humans. So even if the free will defense explains moral evil as human-caused, it doesn't explain all evil. And remember, if God created us, he's in control of all the evils, both moral and natural. But Swinburne gives us the free will defense, pointing out that it's true, that does cover moral evils, human-caused evils. But he also sort of extends it to natural evils in my opinion, a creative way. So he also makes some other points about how free will operates that sometimes non-believers don't fully understand in his view. So for instance, he points out that God wouldn't micromanage us, right? Sometimes you hear a non-believer say, oh, look, why didn't God just blow the hurricane out of the way and not hit the orphanage so all those people didn't die? And Swinburne says, well, God isn't fully determining every single thing that happens in the universe. God creates the universe and determines the conditions that will arise, but we bring about those conditions. So he's saying that God creates the world to have the conditions for existence, but he doesn't create every specific detail of it. So he's not going to create the world under these conditions and then stop every evil and blow every hurricane out of the way. That's what Swinburne means, that God doesn't determine evil in advance. He allows for the possibility of it, and then we bring it about by our own free will. So, in other words, he's going to, according to Swinburne, God allows us to make our own mistakes. And this will relate, as we'll see soon, to his God as a Father argument. So Swinburne also points out that this gives us true responsibility for the world. The fact that God gives us this extra ability to choose and these extra possibilities of evil is that it gives us real, genuine responsibility for our actions and real, genuine responsibility for other people. And the way he makes this argument is he points out, imagine that if the only thing I could do, if the only thing that logically and physically was allowed was I could only do good things. What if I could only give you gifts? It wasn't possible for me to forget to give you a gift. What if that was the case? Then when I give you a gift, would it really mean anything? No, says Swinburne, because it would have happened anyway. There was nothing else I could do. However, if it's possible that I don't give you a gift on your birthday and I forget, but then I do, that makes it all the more valuable, right? That makes my choice more valuable, and that makes my responsibility to you more genuine, because I could have not done it. So Swinburne's basically saying that we don't want a perfect universe where only good things are possible, because it takes away the meaning and the value of our decisions. So he says, the way he puts it is, God gave us some of his power. God's all powerful, right? We're not. But God, being creations of God, according to Swinburne, Swinburne delegates, gives us some of that power, which then gives us responsibility to help create the world. So in a way, Swinburne's saying is, we are God's little minions, so to speak, to help bring about his plan. Right? So we have that responsibility to do good or to do bad. If it were just all good, if everything that was possible was good, it wouldn't have as much value. Right? So genuine responsibility, Swinburne says. Just like a father. Okay, let's look at this is perhaps what he's most famous for, God as a father. So Swinburne says that God delegates responsibility to us. He gives us, and this is what I was kind of saying before on the last point, he gives us some of his responsibility. Just like a father delegates responsibility to his children. And he gives the example of like a father who goes away out for the night and leaves his older son to watch his younger son. Now, would a good father say, okay, to the older son, say, okay, I'm trusting you to take care of younger son, Jimmy or whatever, I'm trusting you to take care of him. Now, does a good father then leave and pretend he's left, but then walk around the back of the house and stare in the window to make sure that the older son watched over the younger son? No. A good father will trust and give some responsibility to his son so that his son can take responsibility for himself over the younger son. Now notice that the father knows the older son might screw it up, right? Maybe he'll let the younger son stay up too late, or he won't know how to handle him, or the younger son will run away to his friends. But that is necessary, says Swinburne, so that the older son can learn from his mistakes. Right? So, and in some cases, you might even find that a father or mother or parent wants their child to actually get hurt so that they'll learn, right? That maybe they want them to get into a fight, verbal or otherwise, so that they learn what it's like and they know how to avoid it in the future. Maybe they want them to deal with adversity so they gain from it. And that's what Swinburne is saying, is that God can't give us a perfect, absolute, happy universe if he wants us to learn and grow and have meaning in our lives. So ultimately, we are God's children, according to Swinburne, and he is our father, and he guides us to help us learn, but he doesn't micromanage, he doesn't get overly involved. He allows us to learn from our mistakes, and therein comes the evil. Now, counter-argument to Swinburne here. So, some have pointed out that the way a good father deals with his son is actually not the way that God deals with his children. So let me just put it simply and directly. Does God, does a good father kill a couple of his children so his other child learns? Does he put 3 of his children through a Holocaust so his 4th and 5th children learn? No. And I hope you can see where this counter-argument's going, because the real God, if he exists, clearly allows us to suffer tremendous, tremendous pain and evil, more than just a little bit like losing a fight so you learn. Right? It's not the same as a good father, many would argue. A good father allows his children to go through some adversity, but they're not going to allow them to die. And yet we have to admit that God does allow people to die for the sake of his plan if he exists, and not just people, innocent children too, right? So it's not, many would point out, it's not quite the same as a good father, right? So in other words, people like Nagel from the last article would deny the analogy between the father and God. But Swinburne goes on, and I really like this point personally from Swinburne, and he points out that suffering isn't really a pure loss for us. So the problem of evil is often presented by non-believers like Nagel as though suffering is just inherently bad. Right? There's too much suffering in this world, and it's just bad. It has to stop. And it wouldn't, if there were a good God, it would stop. But what Nagel points out is that, Swinburne, this author points out, is that suffering sometimes is a good thing. Sometimes many would argue that their lives are defined by their suffering. They went through some terrible experience and they came out the other side and they grew from it. So another way to say this is, you may remember the philosophy that the Stoics rejected in ancient Rome, hedonism, the idea that life is just about pain and pleasure. And so Swinburne's basically saying life isn't like hedonism. He's also rejecting hedonism. He's saying life has greater goods to be had from it than just the physical suffering. Right? Someone could even go through torture and war, or a terrible experience in war and grow tremendously from that. And Swinburne even gives the example of somebody dying young, like dying as a martyr in the military, and says the joy and the glory that they bring to their family, even though they're sad that the person died, the fact that they died as a martyr and the honor that they bring to the family, that's a greater good. And that shows that life was valuable. So Swinburne is saying that, as you can see in that last point there, suffering makes our choices matter more. It makes us vulnerable. Right? It makes us have meaning. If it wasn't possible to have that great sense of suffering, then great growth wouldn't be possible. So this is what Swinburne's doing here, which I like, is that he's sort of going into depth on what suffering is. Because oftentimes when a non-believer like Nagel presents the problem of evil, they just say suffering's bad, end of story. And Swinburne says, well, wait a minute, let's look at the details of how suffering works. Related to this reason, Swinburne knows that there's going to be a counter-argument here. Because somebody could say, well, but fine, why does God have, why does he have the right to allow us to suffer in the first place? We shouldn't suffer to begin with. Granted, somebody might argue, suffering does lead to a greater good. But why is God justified in letting us suffer? Now, Swinburne makes an analogy, or I should say a disanalogy, to a doctor to make this point. Because he says the reason why we even have that thought, that why does God have the right to allow us to suffer, is when we hear of some mad scientist type doctor, which unfortunately there are historical examples of, where some immoral doctor took a bunch of people, sometimes disabled people. This has happened. It's unfortunate, to say the least. It's terrible, where they take other people and they operate on them without their consent. And when we hear about something like that, we naturally and rightly, I would argue, think it's terrible. But Swinburne says, look, the reason why we think that's terrible is because it's one human doing it to another human. They're equal. They're both human. They're both mortal humans. However, when God allows us to suffer, he's literally the author of our being. Therefore, we get mad at the doctor rightly. God isn't like a doctor because a doctor is a human. God is a all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving being. Right? So we rightly get mad at the doctor, but we shouldn't get mad at God, says Swinburne, because we wouldn't be here without him, according to Swinburne. He created us to begin with. If you create something, Swinburne says, you have the right to do what you want with it to help it learn. But if you're just one of those creations, like a doctor, you don't have the right to do it to other of those creations. Right? So there's an equality between humans that makes a doctor unjustified, but there's a superiority of God to humans that makes it justified in the case of God, at least in Swinburne's view. Sixth reason. Still, says Swinburne, God limits our suffering anyways. It could be worse, we have to admit. It's possible we live if God has all power, it's possible we could have lived in a universe that was just where we could just suffer for 1,000 years. Right? That's possible. And Swinburne says, no, he doesn't allow that. We have limited lifespans, for example. No matter how bad it gets, it's going to end at some point. And he also points out that we have both physical and psychological safety devices. So we have the ability to get over psychological pain over time, for example, but we also have physical healing abilities. When we get a cut or a sore, and even great wounds can heal. So Swinburne says, even if God does have the right to allow us to suffer, and even if he does allow us to suffer so that we improve and gain meaning in our lives, he still limits the amount we suffer. Of course, there's some counter-arguments here too. So the first counter-argument is that, well, granted, we have some safety devices in our body, but there's also cases in which our bodies just break down completely. Cancer, clearly. ALS is a disease where you're pretty much gone within 6 months to a year if you're lucky. Once you get diagnosed and your body just completely shuts down. There's a number of things that can happen to our bodies that go against this idea. Granted, we have safety devices, but there's also a lot of things that can just happen that just mess up, right? Where our bodies just mess up like a bad computer program. Many would point that out. Second thing some people would point out, non-believers, is what about hell? Right? What about hell? That is, by definition, in Christianity and Islam, monotheistic faiths, that is by definition an eternal suffering, right? Suffering forever, no forgiveness. So would a good God allow his children to suffer eternally? Eternally, right? Without any chance of forgiveness? Is that what a good God would do? Many people would say no, that the existence of hell clearly disproves, you could argue, some would argue, that the existence of evil in our world, fine, it's finite, it will go away. But hell is, again, defined as eternal suffering with no chance of salvation. So, anyways, there's that. Now, to be fair, there's different concepts of hell out there, and it depends on what concept of hell you believe in. In Buddhism, hell is just a stage where people do go through suffering, but it's not eternal. And also, there's some people who believe in God and they don't believe in heaven and hell. So it depends on your belief as to whether that's a problem for you. If you do believe in a good God and you do think there's a heaven and hell, that's something you should really reflect on. Would a good God allow a hell of eternal suffering? Anyways. Finally, Swinburne, although some of what he's talked about thus far touches on natural evils, he wants to give us a deeper reason why natural evils exist. And it relates to moral evil. So basically, ultimately what he says is that natural evils exist to give us more choice in our decisions. That's why his defense kind of runs into both moral and natural evils. So he says there's two ways that natural evils give us more choice and more responsibility. The first is that knowing natural laws that produce evils, say knowing about germs, gives us knowledge of how to bring about them. And then related to that is that knowledge then opens up a greater range of choice for how we deal with those evils. So with germs, let's just take medicine. We can learn all about medicine and how diseases work. We can learn about that to develop cures to help people, or we can learn about it to create germ warfare to hurt people. And this is Swinburne's point, that the more we learn about science and the natural world, the greater choices we have in how we deal with that. Now, he also points out that, and this is many people see as one of his strongest points, and I do somewhat agree here, is that natural evils bring out the heroes. They bring out the heroes. Right? When there's Hurricane Katrina, there were people who came out of the woodworks who literally drove across states to help those people suffering with canned goods and blankets and stuff like that. Even non-natural evils like 9/11, huge disasters, people come out of the woodworks to save people. There were people who were pulling others out of the rubble from the buildings, who risking their lives to save other people. So Swinburne says, without all this adversity in the world, then we wouldn't have as great a range of choice to show our mettle. So the reason why we value heroes and why we support them and we give them the credit they deserve is because they could have not done it. Right? So again, going back to the greater range of choice, making our actions have meaning and value in this world. So Swinburne says this is ultimately what happens. Now, he also makes this other point that I think is kind of interesting, is that he says that when these evils occur, when these natural evils occur, they can actually set up a feedback loop of responses. So he points out that, like, let's say someone gets cancer and it's a naturally caused cancer. It's not something they did, like smoking, right? It was a genetic disorder, say, and they're suffering in the hospital. Now, that sets up a range of behaviors for other people where they can decide to be compassionate to that person, or they can be callous and not go visit them in the hospital, right? And then that sets up another range for the person suffering in the hospital. Do you become resentful of those people, or are you accepting of their choices? So the suffering of evils by people tests the mettle. It tests the character of the people who are involved with them. So Swinburne is saying, without those interlocking evils and the sort of choices that are possible as a result, our lives wouldn't have as much meaning. Right? The meaning goes away without those deeper choices, where our choices really do have a huge effect on other people and on the world, Swinburne would say. So ultimately, those are the reasons why Swinburne thinks God would allow evil, and why it is not an argument against God to say that there's evil in the world, because there could be these reasons for why he would allow it. The last thing Swinburne does to emphasize his point is he gives us this kind of hypothetical scenario. He says, let's say you were, before this life, before you were born, before you entered this life, let's just assume you had a choice of two different existences you could have. Let's just say you're about to live this life. God comes down and says, all right, here you go. You have these two choices. Here they are. First choice, you have an adult-like life with a bunch of pleasure, right? You're just doing heroin all the time, whatever you want to do. You're having a great time, but you have no effect on other people. First choice. Second choice, you have an adult-like life with lots of pain, but unbeknownst to you, during the pain, you have a positive effect on others over the next few years. You know you'll have that effect in advance, but while the pain's happening, you don't know. And Swinburne thinks that, so let me put it this way. The first choice is lots of pleasure, no effect on people. And the second one is pain, but effect on other people. And Swinburne thinks that the second choice is the obvious one, because we wouldn't want a life, even if we're just experiencing pleasure, there's no meaning. Right? If you're just sitting on your couch all day, just playing video games and doing heroin, there's no meaning. You don't have any influence on other people. You don't have any connection. And Swinburne says that a life with more meaning would be the second one. Even though you're experiencing pain, to have that influence on others, that's a greater value than the pain you're experiencing. Right? So this goes back to his point that pain isn't always a pure loss. It leads to a greater good, in his view. And Swinburne ends by saying, more or less, that that's the world we actually live in. We live in a world where the second choice is more closer to the world we live in, and it's the best world we could live in. There are some theologists who have said we live in the best of all possible worlds, and I think that's what Swinburne is suggesting here, that the world we live in, despite its flaws, it's the best one we could live in, the one that God has given us with the most goods that can help us develop and find meaning. Okay, that pretty much sums up the article, so I'm going to stop there.